Hello everyone, and thank you for attending my talk. My name is Eloy Geenjaar, and I'm a PhD student at the Trent Center and at Georgia Tech. My talk today will be about Voxelwise dynamical factor learning, and I will tie the idea of understanding the dynamics in the brain together with multimodal fusion to provide a perspective for future fMRI research. This work was done in collaboration with some amazing collaborators, whose names I've included on the slide. Thank you in particular to Dr. Vince Calhoun, my PI and co-organizer, and Dr. Amrit Kashyap, my other co-organizer. Dynamics are fundamental to brain computation, but whole brain dynamics are hard to explore due to the inherent issues with fMRI data, such as low signal-to-noise ratio, signal that is not related to neuroactivity, and because the data is high-dimensional. To tackle the latter problem, so the high dimensionality, researchers often reduce the spatial dimensionality of the data with methods like principal component analysis, or PCA, independent component analysis, or ICA, and the parcellation of the brain into anatomical regions, or ROIs. One major drawback with these methods is that they do not take the underlying dynamics of the signal into account. This means that the low-dimensional data may lose some of the dynamics in the original signal. As an example, this is what three-dimensional PCA data looks like for 50 subjects from a left foot and left hand tapping task. The dynamics are not smooth, even though we expect points close in time to be close together in this low-dimensional space, because we are mostly interested in the low-frequency content of the fMRI data. I should note that the high-dimensional fMRI data was bandpass filtered to focus on low-frequency content. Although PCA is a great way to visualize high-dimensional data, in the case of fMRI, the signal it captures may be noise due to the inherent limitations of the fMRI data. To tackle this issue, we want to incorporate the idea that these spatial reduction techniques ensure the data still adheres to a dynamic system. But what is a dynamic system? One simple example is a ball rolling off a hill. Given the shape of a hill, we can simulate how the ball will roll down because the ball is constrained by both the hill and the gravity acting on the ball. These two forces are the dynamic system in this example. However, how the ball will behave also depends on where we start the dynamic system, which in this analogy is the location of the ball. If we put the ball at the top of the hill, it will not move and stay where it is. This is initial condition 1 on the figure. If we lay the ball on either side of the hill, it will roll down and over time settle in the valley. These are initial conditions 2 and 3. However, for fMRI data, we do not know the initial conditions or the shape of the hill. Thus, we need to find patterns in the data that allow us to identify both the initial conditions and the dynamic system itself. Or in our analogy, what does the hill look like and where does the ball start? Before I introduce what our proposed method model looks like, I first want to quickly describe what an autoencoder looks like. In fact, a perfect linear autoencoder trained to minimize reconstruction error is the same as PCA. In this case, we have fMRI data that goes into a spatial encoder, which takes a brain volume with n voxels and reduces it to d dimensions, which it does for each time point independently. This is to make sure that the high-dimensional data is now in a lower dimensional space so we can easily analyze it. Then a spatial decoder maps the d dimensions back to n voxels to reconstruct the original fMRI data. So essentially the input to an autoencoder would be fMRI time series with, let's say, 100 volumes, and each volume has 1,000 or 10,000 voxels. And what we get back is a time series with 100 latent vectors, and these latent vectors are now lower dimensional, let's say 3-dimensional or 5 or 10. In our model, we add 2 extra blocks in between. Namely, we use a recurrent neural network, which is a deep learning algorithm that works well for temporal data, and we predict the initial conditions given the low dimensional time series we obtain from the spatial encoder. Then, with those initial conditions, we use a neural ODE, which is a neural network that can learn ordinary differential equations, or an RNN to simulate the dynamics. Or in our hill analogy, simulate how the ball rolls down the hill given the location of the ball, which are the initial conditions. And we reconstruct the simulated time series using a spatial decoder to reconstruct the original fMRI data again. Similar to the autoencoder, our model produces a low-dimensional time series where each time point has a dimension d. So like I said earlier, like 3 dimensions, 5, 10, whatever, thus reducing the spatial dimensionality of the data. However, as you can see in the side-to-side comparison, the dynamics themselves are much smoother for our model, and the 2 subtasks are more distinctly separated from each other. Note that the right figure is a 3-dimensional PCA projection of an 8-dimensional version of our model for visualization purposes, because it's very hard to visualize 8 dimensions. The reason that the low dynamics from our model are much smoother is that they are constrained to follow a dynamic system, which in this case is either the neural ODE that I talked about or a recurrent neural network. In the case of this photo, it's a neural ODE. To evaluate whether this does not just visually improve the results, but also quantitatively, we evaluate our model on the HCP dataset. To evaluate our model against the PCA and autoencoder baseline, we use between 1,040 and 1,080 subjects, depending on how many subjects had task fMRI data for that specific task. We use the motor, relational, and working memory tasks from the HCP dataset and train the model independently for each type of task, because we assume that each task has distinct dynamics. We do the same for the PCA and autoencoder baselines, and evaluate our model on a completely held-out test set. We use both a neural ODE and an RNN as models for the dynamics to compare different models of the dynamics. To train the model, we split the data into subtasks of the same length. So for the motor task, these are left hand tapping, right hand tapping, left foot tapping, right foot tapping, etc. And then perform classification of what subtask is being performed in the test set. The network is trained to minimize the reconstruction error, and we use both a linear and a nonlinear spatial encoder and decoder pair to compare the effect of nonlinearities on how well the model performs. I will first just walk through the results for the motor task, and then show the other results. So both the neural ODE, which in this case we call the node, and RNN are our proposed models. The node is the purple line, and the RNN is the orange line in this figure. The dashed lines are the nonlinear versions of the models, whereas the solid lines are the linear versions. There are 5 subtasks in the motor task, so a random classification accuracy would be 20%. Our models all outperform the autoencoder and PCA by quite a large margin for all latent dimensions. And so the latent dimensions are on the x-axis, and they are the low dimensional embeddings that I talked about. So how large is this low dimensional embedding that we project to from the amount of voxels we have? So let's say we have 100,000 voxels. We map that to, in this case, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64. And then we look at the classification accuracy between different methods. So now to the rest of the results. From left to right, the classification task gets progressively harder. So for the first figure on the left, we perform binary classification between a 0-back and a 2-back working memory task. Then in the second figure, the two classes are that the trial is either a control trial or a trial where the shapes on the screen are related to each other. This is called the relational task in the HCP dataset. The third figure is also from the working memory task, but instead of classifying the 0-back versus 2-back working memory, we classify what types of object the subjects need to remember. This is either a face, a tool, a body, or a place. Then lastly, the figure on the right shows the classification accuracy for the motor subtasks, except we only use voxels from the visual region instead of from the whole brain. So this essentially means that we're classifying what motor subtask someone is going to be performing based on the fMRI data in the visual region only. Thus, the model only has access to dynamics in the visual area of the brain, and since the motor subtasks are preceded by a visual cue that tells the subject what body part they need to tap, there should be enough information in the visual region alone to classify what subtask is occurring. However, classification accuracy can also be driven by feedback connections to the motor cortex. And we indeed see that our model is able to do this pretty well, getting about 80% classification accuracy. Overall, though, our model outperforms the PCA and the autoencoder baselines by quite a margin, and in general, the node is slightly better than the RNN, but this kind of depends on which version of the node or RNN you look at. For example, the nonlinear version of the RNN oftentimes does much better than the comparatively between the linear version than the nonlinear version of the node. To ensure that the dimensionality reduction itself is performed on regions of the brain that are related to the task, we calculate how much of the variance in the group average task maps are explained by the linear version of the decoder. We can compare the matrix in the decoder and what regions it maps to with the group average task maps. For all methods, this is a voxels by latent dimensions matrix. We only compare the group average task maps for the motor task because it is the most spatially localized task in the brain from the task that we used. Both working memory and relational processing are likely not as localized and may be more distributed. Although PCA has a lower reconstruction error, so it has better reconstructions technically, it does not actually capture the task-specific regions in the brain better than our models. Both our models outperform both the PCA and autoencoder, but especially our node-based model performs much better, which means that it captures much more of the actual important variance in the brain, although it does capture less overall variance in the brain. This kind of indicates that PCA may actually capture more variance, but it captures more noise as variance instead of capturing more of the interesting variance, which is related to the task. And this is one of the inherent limitations of fMRI data, is that a lot of the variance in the data itself may actually be related to noise and not actually be related to the task or to any neuroactivity. These are promising results, but because a neural network requires a lot of data to be trained, we currently train the whole model across subjects. In the future, we want to move towards subject-specific dynamics, which is especially important for resting state data, because different subjects have different dynamics during resting state. For task fMRI data, it is a reasonable assumption that dynamics across subjects are similar for the same task. But for resting state fMRI data, we need to find subject-specific dynamics. One important way we think we can learn subject-specific dynamics is to use multimodal data. To give a quick introduction into multimodal data fusion, there are 4 main approaches to using multimodal data. These approaches rank from using a minimal amount of information from the 2 modalities to using a large amount of information from the modalities. This is from left to right in our figure. The least informative way of using multimodal data is to look at each modality separately. Then second from the left, we can also integrate information from 2 modalities that is shared between the 2 modalities. The 2 approaches on the right use a lot of information encoded in the modalities, and asymmetric fusion uses one modality to constrain the other, whereas with symmetric fusion, both modalities are treated equally to find joint information in the modalities. In recent work, we have tried to learn more subject-specific representations, not for dynamics specifically, but for multiple static modalities. In this case, what we're doing is symmetric multimodal fusion. To do this, we imagine modalities as colors that form a spectrum, as shown on this slide, where a subject can fall anywhere on the spectrum that is created by features from 2 different modalities. Each color on the spectrum is subject-specific, and we apply this approach and this general framework to a neuropsychiatric spectrum disorder, more specifically schizophrenia. To find the features from each modality that span the spectrum, because in the previous slide I showed you an example with 2 features that I didn't name, but in reality we want to find these features that are maximally independent so that they're interesting. We want to use an unsupervised approach that makes it easy to apply this method on a variety of data sets and makes easier to train this model on a large set of data. We specifically adapted a disentangled multimodal variational autoencoder to neuroimaging data. The idea behind this model is that each modality contains both private and shared information. We want to find this private and shared information by mapping the original neuroimaging data to a low-dimensional representation. In this case, I'll call that representation Z. Both modalities contribute to the shared information, but the private information is modality specific. So by making the representation low-dimensional, the autoencoder is forced to learn shared information to better reconstruct the modalities, because it only has a limited amount of dimensions to put information in. Each modality is then reconstructed using its private information and the shared information that is contributed by both modalities. We train this network on each possible pair for 4 different types of information: fractional anisotropy maps, voxel-based morphometry, static functional connectivity, and spatial ICA maps. After clustering subjects in the latent space, so in this low-dimensional space with private, shared, and private information, we find unique differences between subjects with and without a schizophrenia diagnosis, depending on the modality pair. So different modality pairs have different differences for clusters with a lot of schizophrenia patients. We also observe that subjects are not always clustered together across modality pairs. Both of these findings indicate that different modality pairs highlight different aspects of a single subject, and thus provide us with more subject-specific information. Although the 2 works that I've presented are not yet directly coupled, I believe that there is a bright future in combining both ideas into a unified framework and discover Voxelwise structure-function relationships. First, in terms of the practical utility of training these models, bringing multimodal fusion and dynamic factor learning together allows us to train these models with enough data to move towards subject-specific models of the brain. In doing that, the multitude of ways that structure bidirectionally interacts with function is going to be an exciting way to try and understand neuropsychiatric disorders. For example, whether certain parts of someone's resting state dynamics are likely under their connectome or brain geometry are frameworks in which we can distinguish aberrant dynamics. Focusing more on dynamics and its interconnection between other modalities also benefits therapy development because generative models like the ones I presented here allow for the simulation of interventions on the model. This should obviously be done with extreme care, and these models should not be taken as a ground truth, but they can make for an exciting testbed and indicate fruitful future directions in research. I hope this presentation was helpful, and if you have any questions, please do reach out. I will be at the conference in person, but I would be happy to answer any questions you have or talk about ideas you want to explore together. My email is on the slide, and if you want to check out the two works I discussed today, I've also added a QR code for both. Thank you very much for your time.